What we're going to discuss today is social change in modern India. As students of sociology, you'd be already familiar with how much concern sociologists have with the issue of social change. One of the reasons perhaps is that social change is pervasive, it's all around us. The other most important issue that we must keep in mind is that sociology itself as a discipline emerged in times of profound social change. You are familiar with the fact that all the pioneering sociologists were grappling with the various dimensions of social change. Well, whether it was Durkheim, who was trying to depict the transition from mechanical to organic solidarity, whether it was Weber discussing the whole issue of rationalization and the emergence of a disenchanted world, whether it was Marx trying to understand the profound changes which were taking place. It's not surprising, therefore, that social change is so distinctive of the sociological enterprise. In the Indian context too, very often we feel that social change is all around us. It is pervasive in modern India, and in that context very often we contrast it with an ancient India which is sort of unchanging. It's in this context that again we are going to have this discussion with Professor Yogendra Singh, who is with us today and who has written for the last many decades looked at the various aspects of social change in modern India. So, I would like you to sort of briefly explain to us the early experience of Indian sociology with the kind of changes which were taking place in our country.
Well, sociology in pre-independent India was focused with urgent problems of society. If we see Radhakal Mukherjee's writings, for instance, he was engaged in studies of population problems of poverty, teeming millions, and problems of development, economic development, development of farming. He wrote a book called Fields and Farmers of Awadh in one of his studies. And D.P. Mukherjee and G.S. Ghure, the two other, G.S. Ghure, who led the Bombay Department of Sociology, also engaged himself in the issues of identity in India, issues of the relationship of castes and how caste functions as an institution of differences and hierarchies, and how really it combines itself with the processes of change. And although he is concerned with the issues of change much more sharply in his village studies after Century and Carter, and his writing on social tensions, where he talks of India's social change and the kind of conflict which is emerging. D.P. Mukherjee was frontally engaged with the process of social change, but he was concerned with the rise of the middle classes. Middle class, a very important element which triggered the process of social change in India, which continues to some extent even today, because much of the dominant theme of transformation in India, like the new information sector, the new capitalism, new urbanization processes, new agriculture, all of them are led by a new middle class, although it is not the same middle class, a new middle class. So, even before independence, sociologists were engaged in the study of change, they were concerned with change, because change was also the discourse central to the national movement, the movement for emancipation and freedom. N.K. Bose was very close to the process of Congress. He was worked with Mahatma Gandhi and so on. Later on we find that sociologists come very frontally to tackle problems of social change, because with independence came planning process, and early sociologists, they studied on agrarian issues, village. They began to study urbanization, they studied community development and panchayat system. They studied the processes of labor productivity. They studied political culture, political parties, voting behavior. So, the new institutions which came with independence, addressing the development in sectors where older institutions had become obsolete. For instance, feudalism, Indian feudal classes or the middlemen, rentier classes. Land reform was very important to change that.
So, at this point I would just interrupt you briefly to ask you, like you mentioned that the interest in social change was there from the very beginning, at different points. You also brought in the whole influence of the national movement on many of the Indian sociologists, and later maybe their active involvement in some developmental questions. Was this the dominant pattern in the manner in which Indian sociologists discuss social change? Because very often in textbooks, the manner in which we study is that we discuss, when we discuss social change in India, we discuss modernization, we discuss westernization, we discuss Sanskritization. The manner in which you are presenting it seems much larger and much more complex. So, would you briefly explain to us the different trends which were there?
Well, subtle theme in sociology's study of change throughout has been one, to observe the reality of change, how change is taking place, and there the matrix has been of tradition, modernity, industrial and the agricultural, rural and urban. But the second subtle theme which was implicit was concept formation, indigenization, and Sanskritization, westernization is a good example of how this issue is recognized. Although westernization is a concept which is used by Professor M. N. Srinivas in a very historically bounded manner, but later on he did recognize its wider implications, because westernization is not one but multiple, and therefore, it is a generic concept rather than specific to is one style, one way of looking at things, one way of defining one's identity and the goals of social transformation. So, we find similarly the consciousness of indigenization, consciousness of this kind in many other sociological writings of that period. For instance, in the writings of Professor Dubey or I. P. Desai or Kapadia, who studied family system, we review their contribution. Ramkrishna Mukherjee, for instance, in his several writings takes this perspective on change within the framework of the Indian tradition, Indian cognitive systems. In fact, here I find two ways that Indian sociologists seem to be responding. One was the empirical tradition, and in the empirical tradition such as writings of Professor I. P. Desai, we find he skirts the issues of theory, skirts the issues of East and West, and directly tries to look at reality and then observation over a sustained period, over a long time cycle, that is for instance, the study of Mahova, the family, the family cycle. He finds that it tells his own theoretical story, because his study of Mahova family, though not anchored in theory to begin with, comes out with a theory that one has to look at the cyclical transformation in family from single family to joint family, rather than a linear concept of the single family and joint family as we inherited from the West. So, here we find a good example. In fact, if you look at the Asiatic tradition of sociology, then this is a skill and a tradition which Japanese developed. They did not go in their sociology, there is no conscious effort to build theory, there is empiricism. Professor Ramakrishna Mukherjee looks at sociology from a slightly different perspective, because he accepts theory, but he accepts theory as a inductive deductive process, not favorable to one particular philosophical matrix of theory, such as Marxism, Weberian sociology or Durkheimian sociology. He says that all these theoretical constructions are to be the same. What matters is how we operationalize it. So, sociologist's task to him is to operationalize conceptual categories, and it is in that process lies the process of indigenization, because we cannot operationalize any theoretical construct without taking into note the empirical realities of contemporaneity, of here and now. That is where it takes control of the problem of indigenization as a whole.
Right.
So, there are different types of solutions that Indian sociology was offering throughout 50s and 60s and 70s. Now, sociology later on has become more multidimensional in India.
So, in this context, would there be any relevance to the different orientations, say, of sociology and social anthropology in India, because this relationship has also been very unique in India, and would it in any way affect the manner in which social change was being looked at?
Well, in fact, this issue has come up again and again in India because of historical reasons and because of this nature of the Indian society. Sociology and social anthropology, I should say, were subsumed together.
Right.
So, most sociologists were also anthropologists. Anthropologists in terms of the methods. That is the only distinction that we can make between sociology and social anthropology in India, is the way they looked at reality. Anthropologists were more given to studying ethnic background, totality of culture, and the whole aspect of a society or a community. Although there are no instances where they outcross the boundaries of anthropological method, except in some few cases, such as D.N. Majumdar's study of a city survey, this urban sector,
Right.
has few other examples. But even anthropology in the West has used statistical methods, so one cannot
make any
dichotomize on that basis. So, this distinction has not really been very important
in the
as
Indian
far as
context.
India is concerned. Although later on there has been more self-consciousness of a distinction between anthropology and sociology, coming particularly from the physical anthropologists.
Okay, but not
So
the social anthropology.
It led to some institutional changes of the organization of profession.
Right.
Rather than organization of the discipline.
So what you are trying to say is this disciplinary thing did not really have that kind of implications here. To go back to a point which you mentioned earlier on in this discussion was about the manner in which the social location or the social background of sociologists themselves refer. Say when we had mentioned westernization and Sanskritization earlier in the discussion, and in more recent times there has been a critique coming, say, from Dalit scholarship, Dalit sociologists, on the manner in which Sanskritization has been used. There has also been a critique from people who do gendered sociology, that Sanskritization as a concept has been extremely gendered. Would you like to just
I have written on this. In fact, we see three phases in the growth of sociology. Early phase of about 2-3 decades was a phase of what I have called consensual sociology, because sociologists themselves came from a homogeneous class background,
Right.
their own training, their own way of, they accepted state's role in transforming Indian society, and they aided the state through planning and development process, from grants from the state agencies, because that was the only agency available to support research projects.
Right.
So, the entire sociological paradigm which developed through this whole long process of 3 decades is of no conflict between sociologist's perspective and state's perspective. In fact, there is a much more of a harmony, except in a very small section of Marxist sociologists who were always raising the bias.
Who also had relationship with the state,
dissent.
right?
Then from 17 onwards, we find that sociologists began to recognize the contradictions of state policies. For instance, the state policy in the agrarian sector. Green revolution helped only rich farmers. What about the poor? What about the tribals? What about the landless? What about the gender? Because green revolution also increased gender discrimination.
Absolutely.
It led to displacement of women from work, as many studies have shown. So, this awareness led to acceptance of the critical perspective in sociology. So, we find that new sociological theoretical orientations become acceptable. Marxism, a kind of neo-Marxism, phenomenological way of looking at really interactionist sociology. This is important process in this. So, in fact, the sociologists became critical in the sense that they will not accept the definition of reality and social policy by the structures of domination. After critical phase, in fact, the process of social change constantly was unfolding itself.
Absolutely.
The policies of reservation, policies of investment in agriculture, community, urbanization, all this led to some mobility from the lower sections, the deprived sections, and as they moved up, a critical element was created for leadership. So, they began to take leadership in the not only in the realm of politics, but also in the realm of professions, the kind of academic culture,
knowledge building itself,
a kind of self ratiocination, in fact a kind of introspection and awareness of identity. Right. So, this I should say explosion of identity takes place as a result of this process of change, in fact, which is paradoxically a result of investment in change.
Yeah, in fact, as you correctly say, there is a whole paradox to it, because the awareness of deprivation arises only because there is an emergent middle class from the traditional marginalized sections who can then now articulate their absence from the body of knowledge.
This is also a transition from the old middle class to new middle class.
Right.
And in fact, a middle class which is constantly in the making, a middle class which is also a melting pot, as it were, because they come from different cultural background, ethnic background, class background, gender. Absolutely. And a new framework of emergent centers of productivity, that is the production of knowledge, production of information, communication, in all these different areas which are now pervading, they are taking root, the new definition of class is taking place.
Right. So, if you look back, say, at the central concepts which are used in sociology, whether it is caste, class, region, ethnicity, tribe, each of them has been undergoing some kind of theoretical questioning and interrogation, precisely because you now have greater visibility of people who now speak on those. The whole issue, say, in the West, when you said Western scholars studied Indian sociology, but once Indian sociology started studying them, you had a different perspective. So, you had earlier a whole discussion, say, of caste tribe relationship. So, whereas you have the emergence of tribal scholarship from the northeast who would question that we did not have a caste tribe kind of continuum.
Yes, in fact, the triggering of new information revolution in India is having the effect of bypassing some of the difficulties of transition, such as telephony, such as computerization, such as websites.
Right.
In most roadside villages in India, transformation is taking place in a very rapid pace. For instance, the villages that I studied, I find that the notion of community and caste and class have undergone tremendous change. The caste structure has lost its control over the caste members of the same community, because they are now migrated. They have migrated from the village to different parts. So, the control of caste over the members declines,
has diminished,
and therefore, the ritual structure, the kinship structure which governed the traditional relationships has become not as viable as in the past. So, this change, which should have in one sense led to decline of caste, has been compensated by another change, that is political culture of caste. Right. So, caste as identity is merging beyond its territorial boundary with castes outside, like the other backward class caste, Dalit caste, etc., etc., who are supported by political parties.
Right.
So, caste as we used to know it, as it was earlier defined in sociology, will have to be rethought. So, although it is not totally gone, it offers the anchorage, the root,
which is there,
but it is undergoing tremendous change.
So, in fact, this is probably in a certain sense related to say the whole idea of the nation as an imagined community, which becomes a political entity. So, probably the communities, it is very interesting, sir, that you mentioned the whole technological changes which has happened, which has had its own impact on the manner in which social change is taking place. So, in this context, in the context of these new more contemporary social changes, how do we look back at concepts which we have earlier used, like Sanskritization? In a certain sense, would it still be valid? Would the reference models change because technology has taken over?
Well, Sanskritization was a term which Professor Srinivas used, also somebody else also, I am told, coined the word earlier. But the context in which he studied was specific to first his study of the Kurgs, where he used that at one time used the word Brahmanization, and it became later on Sanskritization, which as he defines is the other lower caste in the caste hierarchy, borrowing the lifestyle and the customs and cultural elements from the upper castes. Well, this framework was valid for some time, but social change in India completely altered the context. One of the changes was political empowerment through voting behavior.
Right.
So, most places it is the lower caste which came into power. In fact, power in most states shifted from Brahminical and upper caste to the OBCs. Right. Because of this. Entire South India, where Brahmin were dominant, they lost power totally. So, this made Sanskritization non-attractive. In fact, it became neutral term. They would rather celebrate their identity rather than borrow from somebody else's culture. Right. So, I should think that Sanskritization has viability only in the sense that Sanskritization means larger ambience of the Indian tradition.
So, it would
if we enlarge it in that sense, then we can say that we have still not given up the notion of Sanskritization. Right. We are conscious of our own tradition.
So, likewise, westernization in the globalized context would have also undergone similar changes.
That too has become very porous. because of globalization.
Right. So, what is Indian becomes dominant, and probably you may have a reverse process taking
exactly
place.
This has happened,
Yeah.
and both in terms of Sanskritization and Westernization,
Right,
because political empowerment has annulled the notion of Sanskritization.
Right.
Globalization has annulled the concept of Westernization.
Right.
So, we are in a new process of transformation.
As we sort of come to the tail end of our discussion, I would really like to thank you, sir, for being able to share your rich experience with the people. And before we wind up today's discussion on social change in India, you would have again noticed the very close relationship between knowledge production and the people who produce the knowledge, because very often we tend to see what is written as something which is God given or divine, whereas actually people, human beings, women and men, upper caste or lower caste, hypothetically, are people who are writing it. So, it is very important that whenever we discuss social change in India, we do not see it as a given body of knowledge which is unchanging forever, but try and look at the processes which have been involved historically in this production of knowledge. Like we saw in our discussion today, the manner our tryst with colonialism, the early sociologists attempt to look at social change which was taking place in the early years, the state development, the state investment in spreading development, the emergence of the middle class among earlier marginalized section, who then emerge and articulate their own perspective and interrogate the body of social knowledge which has been produced earlier. So, this dynamic process is something which has to be kept in mind. So, when we look at again concepts which we have learned, whether it is westernization, whether it is globalization, modernization, Sanskritization, we have to look at this particular process in a continuum form. Thank you very much, sir.